So in the cultural responsiveness framework, we talk about the centrality of culture. And if we're going to talk about that from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, we also have to identify what are some of the challenges in our Australian society. And one of them is the dominant cultures. So in most societies, there are dominant or marginalised cultures with differing levels of power, acceptance, and feelings of privilege or isolation. And the dominant culture's beliefs, symbols and rituals are the main way business is done. It's what everybody does. And a lot of the time it's not even really recognised because it's something you just do. It's innate. And the dominant culture of a society refers to the main culture in a society which is shared or accepted without any opposition by the majority of the population. So just have a little reflection about what that might look like in Australia today. And a dominant culture is a cultural practice that is dominant within a particular political, social or economic entity in which multiple cultures are present. It may refer to a language, religion, rituals, social values or social customs and norms. And these features are often the norm of an entire society. It is what is expected. It achieves dominance by being perceived as pertaining to a majority of the population and having a significant presence in institutions relating to communication, education, artistic expression, the law, government and business. So for example, mainstream Australia structures itself around predominantly Christian practices. Public holidays, we celebrate Christian events, we have politicians referring specifically to Christian values, we have Parliament opening with prayers, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is one aspect of a dominant culture in a current day Australia. Not everybody is Christian in Australia, but there is a dominance around that. And we do not all practice Christianity, but we live in a society where Christianity is the mainstream framework for public life, and it is accepted. That's just an example. There are other dominant practices that reflect a certain value base, and dominant cultures in Australia is also around that Anglo-European or Westminster system of government. That comes from England. We still have an English Queen as our monarch. We still refer to the English in our systems. And that's how we make laws. That's how our government works. It's how our constitution reads. So these dominant symbols and practices affect how we understand our lives and how we see and place ourselves in society. It's also how we and others engage with each other. So what happens when minority cultures, like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and what happens when they feel excluded from society? And if the majority of those in authority either obstruct or challenge or are intolerant of those cultural practices? It leads to a lot of negativity. It leads to stereotyping. It leads to racism. It leads to that unacceptance of difference. And to be culturally responsive, it is important to understand where you are positioned in this relationship. Is it a dominant culture or is it another minority culture? And then how do you seek to understand how that fits with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's values, norms, beliefs and traditions and cultures that are dynamic in this country and have been for over 60,000 years? And how are you engaging in that position? And will this enable you to better work and build relationships through and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And so the impact of dominant cultures in this country has been quite significant. And we are just over, 230 years as a colonised nation. And those impacts still exist today for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we can see that with the Black Lives Matters as an example. We can see that we are still fighting for Indigenous rights and recognition in this country as First Peoples. We're still fighting for our own voice to determine and act on policy and legislation that affects us. It's bound in this native title legislation and process. as a non-Indigenous or mainstream law that governs our own ability to say we are native title holders. So there is still effects of dominant culture in Australia that continue. However, we must understand those relationships with each other to understand, are you part of a dominant culture? Why, and owning what that is, and how does that relationship happen with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are different from a dominant culture. And for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're often juggling a dominant culture, our own culture, and there's somewhere in between which overlaps. And that becomes quite political and sensitive and challenging for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.